So welcome to our other presenters this morning, who are Gilly Kay from Loughborough and Hannah Retallack from the Institute of Education at UCL. Sorry, I'm just getting rid of that recording notice. So if we just give ourselves another 6 minutes to prepare mentally, and our programme now looks like this: 9:30, Hannah Yelin on trans and non-binary youth, celebrity culture and community care. At 10, Gilly, who is presenting on heteropessimism on TikTok, hashtag voiceover, and the feminized reactionary digital ecology. 10:30, Dr. Hanna Klien Thomas, joyful navigations, community spaces of learning and intergenerational exchange on Caribbean Carnival Arts. At 11 o'clock, we'll have a break. At 11:15, we have Hannah Retallack. Sorry, I realised I gave Hanna Klien Thomas her title and nobody else. Everybody stopped her. Presenting on Beyond Melancholia, rethinking narratives of sexuality in the secondary school feminism group. And lastly, me, Michele Paule, talking about good for the girls, reference groups and individualism in role model talk. So just have a comfort break of 5 minutes and we'll cue you up to start then. Do you want to cue up your presentation now, Hannah? Okay, we're on 9:30. Do you want to kick off? So,
all right, great.
Our first presentation. Hannah,
thank you. So this work comes from a journal article that is out for review at the moment. I'm just assuming that none of you in the audience are the reviewers, because that could be awkward. And if you are, then please be kind. So this year, get those up there. Trump commenced his new term in office with a law recognising only 2 genders. And the UK Supreme Court ruled that the definition of sex used in the Equality Act 2010 is binary and decided by biology, thereby excluding trans people from protections and prescribing their use of certain spaces, for example, public toilets. Last year saw the indefinite ban removing access to gender-affirming healthcare in the UK. These legislative acts seek to erase the existence of trans and non-binary people, and especially trans and non-binary young people. Against the backdrop of queerphobia, trans and non-binary public figures in particular function to shape public understanding of trans issues through the proliferation of discourse around them. For trans and non-binary youth, seeing how trans public figures are treated and how they respond shapes their understanding of their own standing in society, while also pointing to the possibilities for resistance, reassurance, and agency. Now, as Michele and I have argued elsewhere, and you can buy for the bargain price of $18.99 if you just go onto that QR code there, young people use celebrities to build their ideas about the world, who gets to hold power, and what they imagine for their own futures. This is frequently a source of cultural anxiety, as people fear what Alan and Mendick call the influence of improper, heavily scare quotes there, celebrity on youth. However, youth engagements with celebrity culture are often complex and sophisticated negotiations that demonstrate an acute awareness of social hierarchies, inequality, and risk. Through its emphasis on and ideological construction of individual stars, celebrity culture celebrates and reproduces individualism. As Dyer puts it, stars articulate what it is to be human in society. That is, they express the notion that we hold of the individual. The red carpet marks the boundary between the public and the privileged few, with celebrities embodying the desires and logics of capitalism and individualism. Chatsidakis and et al. Describe the archetypal neoliberal subject as the entrepreneurial individual whose only relationship to other people is competitive self-enhancement. Where celebrity culture's discourse of care has been examined by scholars, it's often been understood as performative public image management rather than rooted in community care or belonging. Thus, celebrity culture propagates an archetype of individual success, while cultural discourses of collective interdependence remain largely constrained to the nuclear family. However, In a society where inheritance, marriage, dynasty, and family frequently operate as institutional pseudonyms for heterosexuality, chosen family, that is, the forging of caring relationships beyond the biological or legal, is a signature of the queer experience. In their interviews with queer young adults, Levin et al. Found that leaning on each other and providing mutual aid were defining features of queer community support in the context of social and medical exclusion. As one of Levin et al.'s participants put it, we just take care of each other. For trans and non-binary 14 to 18-year-olds surveyed by Shah et al., the primary source of support was peers. Similarly, Stone et al. Found that queer community belonging is a primary source of support for trans and non-binary adults. Belonging functions according to intersectional axes. Trans and non-binary people of colour seek support from LGBTQ community of colour, while white, trans and non-binary people could access support from white spaces beyond and in addition to queer community. These non-nuclear bonds are frequently formed across non-linear aging and developmental processes, queering temporality for trans and non-binary people, and shaping both their experience of their own life course and their perception of the future. Youth is, not yet. Youth is a period of identity formation. As Jeffrey Weeks puts it, we search for identities, claim them, assert them, and affirm them. As well as the need to build queer communities of care in a hostile and heterocentric society, seeking out community and like-minded company plays a crucial role in queer identity formation. As Susan Walters argues, we as queers are largely born to and raised by those different from us, are not birthed into a ready-made identity, and must actively seek out and construct a community and identity whose existence is predicated on that seeking. Joseph Goodwin similarly argues that because of its covert nature, the gay community lacks the formal institutions that usually assist in enculturation. The family, churches, schools, and social organisations all take part in teaching people how to operate in the straight culture. Without comparable sources of instruction and support, gay people must rely primarily upon each other to learn how to function effectively within the gay world. Using the examples of YouTube coming out videos, Brian West demonstrates that queer youth often highly value representations of queer people, as they provide a framework whereby to understand and organise their burgeoning desires and feelings of difference. Media representations, therefore, can function to offer that crucial sense of community support, identification, enculturation, and like-minded company in a cis-heterocentric society. Using data from interviews with 10 trans and non-binary young people aged 14 to 23, this paper illuminates the ways in which their identity work using celebrity culture and their search for feelings of like-minded community create new forms of knowledge in opposition to mainstream contexts which other and subjugate them. Now, while using terms like trans and non-binary youth, this study recognises gender as a fluid process rather than a fixed category, and avoids treating these groups as homogenous, instead highlighting both the challenges faced and the complexity of trans and non-binary identities. The public sphere constructs social subjects belonging to minoritised groups as marked by the characteristics of the humiliating positivity of the particular, as Warner puts it, while characteristics associated with power remain an unacknowledged default. As such, social differences are frequently examined as if they are experienced in isolation. Rather, in line with Lebusky and Kiyomaya, I seek an understanding of trans as, quote, contingent while recognising how it meaningfully organises experience, end quote. My duty of care to these young people extends beyond designing safe and reflexive research interactions to responsibility around how trans lives are represented in a queer-phobic society. I remain alert to the ways researchers can reproduce wider cultural pathologization as trans participants are underreported, misrepresented, or alienated through linguistic misidentification. As a cis woman with no first-hand experience of trans or non-binary subjectivity, participants explained their experiences without assuming I knew queer community vocabulary, For example, what we call baby trans people in the community, or what we sometimes call queer misery, or have you heard of the CAS report that came out recently? I conducted the interviews aware that my positionality as an adult, educator, and perceived authority figure would shape participants' responses, and that I may be asking them to reflect for the first time on power and representation, and to do so specifically from the perspective of their trans and non-binary subjectivities. Celebrity is a cultural resource upon which young people draw when forming their understanding of society and their own possible place within it. The trans and non-binary young people I spoke to demonstrated a desire to construct this kind of identity work through celebrities they saw as having experiences and identities to which they could relate. 15-year-old Kai from Oxfordshire talked about the value of having celebrities, quote, to focus on and rally behind because it helps baby trans people thrive. 14-year-old Blake from North Yorkshire articulated the comfort of identification. There's a streamer that I'll watch that's non-binary, Amesy, and I guess it's just nice to have someone that's like you. 15-year-old Brian from Lancashire explained this in specific terms of queer belonging. I'd asked about celebrities that they like and admire. They said, a music artist called Cavetown, he's called Robbie and he is transgender. I know many people look up to him because he speaks up about trans rights and non-binary rights. And then at his concerts, he holds up the flags for like the LGBTQ rights and stuff. And how does that make you feel to see? Represented and seen and feel like seen, yeah. After they listed some examples of trans and non-binary representations, including online figures, queer fanfic characters, and podcasters, I asked Porter, who is non-binary and age 21, and Joel, who is a 19-year-old trans man, the following. What I'm interested in is what it means to you to have these. Porter, I think it's euphoric. Joel, yeah, fantastic. Porter, like being able to be like you, like your pain is seen. I get it. Joel, sorry, if I may, it is really, euphoric is the right word, because going on that same train of seeing your favourite character being portrayed in a certain way. Porter, yes, with the transgender beam. Joel, hits with the transgender beam. The transgender beam is the name of a trans fanfic author and a trope from queer meme culture, which humorously brings to life the transgender gaze, what Halberstam calls the transgender gaze, and a celebratory desire to view characters as queer and trans, regardless of their canonical gender and sexuality. Porter and Joel joyfully describe a euphoric moment of recognition and validation in which their gender identity and their experience of the world align as these media spaces and representations enable them to witness a trans reality in an otherwise cis-centric world. As well as favouring media featuring figures with whom they share identities in terms of gender, age, or race, young people undertake acts of wishful identification, preferring media centred upon characters they wish to be like. This use of media to identify with ideal selves and subjectivities offers young people the opportunity to imagine themselves with the characteristics they find desirable, irrespective of the constraints of their actual realities. Elliot, a 21-year-old trans man from North Yorkshire, explained the role of media figures in his own journey to recognising and having language for his trans experience. Of the fictional trans female character Elle from the book and TV show Heartstopper, Elliot explains how she is represented. What do you think, I asked, what do you think the value is to trans and non-binary young people like yourselves to have that kind of representation? Elliot says, it's very important. People can watch it and go, actually, yes, people do live normal lives because, well, and live like I do, or are similar to me in that they're trans. Yeah, it's very inspirational, I think. And it allows people to watch this TV show and explore it through the TV, explore who they are through a TV show as well. Watching this, they go, actually, that is similar to how I feel and who I want to be. And there's actually a name for it, or something similar to that. I mean, that's how I figured out that I was trans, was through kind of media and YouTube. And it's very important that there's more of it, because I was 17, which nowadays seems quite late to realise. Eliot's articulation of the value of the trans character L demonstrates how media representations can help facilitate young people's own identity development through both visibility and acculturation. Those are Brian West's terms. Ali, a 22-year-old trans man from London, echoed this connection between his own identity development and having adult trans celebrities that he, quote, looked up to, as well as, like Eliot, valuing representations that attribute normalcy to transness. I was quite young when I first came out. I was 14, I think, just turned 14. So I think being quite young and not really knowing any trans people, I think it's important when you're younger to see people who have been through things and have come out the other side and are just living their lives as trans adults. And that's not the most interesting thing about them. That's just like the way they live their life. As Brian West argues, while it can be, quote, a simplifying, essentializing discursive strategy, identity is important in practice, especially for social groups that require coherence and solidarity in order to work against institutional oppression. For the trans and non-binary youth I spoke to, seeing celebrities and media figures who they resemble makes them feel seen themselves and supported through their personal processes of self-determination. This is especially the case in a context where they have little in-person queer community. Blake's parent, some of the younger participants chose to bring parents, said, "You've met more trans and non-binary through gaming than you have," Blake, "Yeah." Blake's parent, "In your physical life." Blake, "Yeah." As Ali said of watching his favourite trans celebrities, quote, "It was the normalisation of something that felt not weird because I didn't know anyone like that or like me." In the accounts of our participants, a politics of community and care emerges in response to a context of heightened risk, as can be seen from this exchange between 4 young people in Liverpool. Joel, "Even if the world looks scary right now, just surround yourself," I've gone a little bit ahead if you want to see that right there, "with people who will look after you and will make sure you are okay at the end of the day." Belle, "I think when times appear to be getting worse, there's the entire queer community, and it's very important to find sort of solidarity." Lil, "I think it is kind of important to display solidarity even when you can't kind of do anything." Porter, "It's like small little nuggets of solidarity." Elsewhere, Breyer emphasized care as the most important quality for people with power and visibility. When asked why anyone would want to hold a high-profile position, they responded, "They want to show people that they care and that they have somewhere to feel safe and that they shouldn't be scared of exploring themselves and who they want to be." Kai was asked whether they saw themselves occupying a high-profile position in the future and replied, suggesting it was capacity to care for others that suited them to such a role, more than their relationship to being visible. They said, "I can sometimes find it difficult to sort of speak in public, but generally I tend to take care of other people, so." Kai and Breyer both articulate a politics of care as a condition of fitness to positions of visibility and power. When asked about the qualities of the trans celebrities he admires, Ali said, "Just very calm, kind. The people that I was watching were just very kind in a way that they didn't care where you come from, what you're doing. They just want you to have a nice day. You get the feeling that they want you to just be happy." When asked about the celebrities they admire, Kai said, "Very caring and gentle, and they're successful as well. I often see what we call baby trans people in the community. They really sort of thrive behind mini celebrities because they helped grow into who they are and such." Kai elaborated on this dynamic in relation specifically to specific celebrity, Jamie Dodger, a YouTuber, author, and trans man. You see in his comment sections and stuff, people sort of rallying behind him and seeing him as almost sort of a father figure. where, like again, baby trans people don't really know what they're doing with their transition, and then they have sort of guiding hands to help them along. In a separate conversation, Eliot's appreciation for Jamie Dodger supports this reading of him as a supportive guide. He is well past post-transition, and he talks very, very openly about what it's like. And you're allowed to go, actually, yeah, I've experienced that. Another example Kai gave of someone they consider a celebrity for their trans and non-binary community was the trans femme illustrator, Trans Girl of the Valley, who they also described through a lens of community care. Kai said, there's a very common image that she made about how it's a meme where it's a trans woman and a trans man, and they're both saying, don't use tape for that. And they're talking about binding. It's an announcement about being safe with how you bind and how you talk. So it's for sort of baby trans people who aren't really aware of how to do things safely like that. I asked, tell me about the kinds of qualities that you think enable them to do those things. Kai said they're caring and their patience. So they've got a bunch of questions coming in from baby trans people. They're not all up in arms, but they're sort of gently explaining things. Niche genres of celebrity in such spaces demonstrate the creative ways queer youth seek out the company of like-minded peers and build support structures for themselves in a society where responses to queer youth range from inadequate support to active hostility. For youth to be able to match their own experiences to those of others offers affirmation and suggests an idea of a shared identity, which queer youth can employ to resist both internal and external negativity about their otherness. This contradicts the abject representations in contemporary news that view queer youth predominantly in relation to suicide risk. Understanding queer youth's use of celebrity representations as a means of finding and building feelings of community and like-minded company, then, is a means to understand their media engagements as agentic. Considering identity formation as a process of actively seeking like-minded company to foster communities of care, and allowing for the ways in which celebrity media representations can offer sources of like-minded support, has the potential to rewrite prevalent narratives of queer youth's objection and disempowerment. The young people we spoke to responded to lack with creativity, both through creative acts of identification that scoured diverse fields and definitions of celebrity, and through creative methods of finding community. While queer youth are operating in a cultural context of ostracization and discrimination that devalues their queerness, analysing trans and non-binary youth's engagements with celebrity culture reveals a sight of not only of witnessing the circulation of cautionary transphobia, but also examples of reassurance, community care, generational guidance, and agency. Thank you.
Hi, just thank you for having me. Honestly, such amazing papers so far. So yeah, feeling very enlivened by these. So yeah, I'm Hannah, one of the three Hannahs here. I'm a lecturer at IOE UCL, where I research in the areas of gender, feminism, sexuality, and education. And I was a secondary school teacher for 10 years, and that's sort of relevant to this paper. And I undertook a very, very long-term PhD. It took me about 8 years part-time while I was also teaching in schools. So you'll see why that's relevant in a minute. So this paper I'm going to present today is something that I'm in the process of writing as an article. So I'm partly thinking it through still. So thank you for your generosity in listening to this. And it explores a particular aspect from my doctoral thesis, which was researching feminism groups in 6 different secondary schools. So today I'm going to draw on a very particular section of data from a focus group that I did with 5 15-year-old girls from a London school based feminism club, in which in my doctorate, my interpretations really emphasised the participants' sense of loss and pain around what they talked about around their sexual encounters. So in my thesis, I argued that the participants' discussion suggested what I called a heterosexualized feminist melancholia, in which the combination of their newfound feminist consciousness, which they'd kind of gained through this feminism club, existed, but alongside a continued sense of disempowerment around their heterosexual encounters. And that combination formed kind of acute senses of and feelings of loss. So I drew on this psychosocial framework, and my thesis proposed that loss was of an idealized image of feminism in various different ways that I'll go through. So today I'm going to kind of present on this and present on some of my previous interpretations, but I also want to call them into question, because I'm thinking about these melancholic interpretations that I form, and kind of arguing that perhaps through their emphasis on loss, there is little capacity or room for change. So to do this, I'm going to draw partly on Rosie Braidotti's 2019 notion of an affirmative ethics, which proposes a kind of more active interpretation of painful affects. So I'm going to consider the girls' narratives through this more affirmative lens to question how melancholic interpretations like the one I made might be sort of rethought to both stay with the trouble of sexual violence whilst also holding on to the capacity for feminist activist resistance in schools. So, sorry, that was a bit of a long intro. So slide 2, please, Hannah, thank you. So a little bit of context. So between 2008 and early 2019, I taught English language and literature across a range of secondary schools. And despite their varied contexts, these schools shared really similar patterns in their regulation of gender and sexuality. And happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. But these experiences raised both personal and political questions for me around how binary and heteronormative conceptions of gender and sexuality are being reproduced in these institutions, and what forms of feminism, different forms of feminism, mean for young people in schools. So this doctoral research focused specifically on teenagers who were already taking part in what they called feminism groups, although it turned out feminism groups meant very different things across different schools. And I researched in 6 distinct secondary schools. So, for instance, there was a suburban comprehensive school, an inner city all girls private school, a private all boys boarding school, an inner city academy school, etc. So they're all like very different. But today I'm going to be talking of this piece of data comes from quite an unusual school. It's a private school, but it's a dance school. So they spend part of their week dancing and doing various forms of other forms of performing arts, and part of their week on kind of more academic subjects. So next slide, please, Hannah. Thank you. So the feminism club that I'm going to talk about today, it was set up during the time that I actually worked. So this was the only feminism club that I researched as part of my doctorate, which was a feminism club that I already had a relationship to and with. So I was part of setting up this feminism club during the time that I worked as a teacher of English at this school. So I worked there briefly. And this club would run during either a lunchtime or after school, and we'd all meet in the school's very small library, where there was a single round table that we would all cram around. And we'd discuss either a topic that one of the students raised, or begin with a prompt that somebody would bring to the session. And I, at the time when I worked at the school, I took quite an active role in this group. I attended most meetings. I provided some elements of kind of focus and structure to the group when they needed it. And this was a group who seemed to connect the personal with the political, that second wave kind of mantra, but like with ease. And they quite quickly became activists, both on and offline. But after facilitating that group and working at that school for around a year, I left that role and I went and worked at a different school. But I remained in intermittent touch with the group members from this club. So I visited that group in an informal capacity a few months after leaving the school. I met them at a few different feminism in schools events. But the focus group interview that I'm going to show you a section of today was the first time since I'd left that job that I'd spent any significant time with that group. So at the time of the focus group that I'll show you, that feminism club was made up of 5 girls. the group was open. It wasn't like just for girls, but it just at that point it happened to be all girls. They were all 15 at the time. They happened to all be white. It was kind of unusually white school considering where it was. But anyway, I can talk more about that in a Q&A. And the three who speak in this extract are called Faye, Vix, and Molly. And just to also let you know, in my PhD, I analyse a lot about my own kind of negotiations with that group, but I don't really have time to do that today. So slide 4, please, Hannah. So this focus group, it was conducted before the pandemic. It was in a context in which movements including #MeToo and Everyone's Invited and attention on feminism in schooling was kind of suggesting new possibilities for young people's interest in calling out experiences of sexual violence and discussing gendered injustice. However, as you know, we're all aware of, I think here, those movements also often and did at this time really coincide with a widespread kind of anti-feminist backlash in which sort of traditional forms of masculinity were perceived as under threat. You know, I've seen Bannett Weiser just being mentioned, Debbie Ging's written extensively on this, and that were kind of reconstituting post-feminist and anti-feminist ideologies. But in my thesis, I was exploring this particular group's engagement with feminisms and through quite a psychosocial lens. And I drew in this particular chapter on conceptualizations of melancholia, which are the ones I'm questioning today. So next slide, please. So in the most kind of traditional psycho kind of analytic form, Sigmund Freud, 1917, in the essay Mourning and Melancholia, he established these two responses to loss. And there was this one that was, he termed mourning, that was kind of deemed more healthy because the ego becomes kind of freed once a loss has been grieved. And then melancholia, which was sort of set in opposition to this as a more unhealthy response, in that whatever has been lost is not grieved in quite the same way because it becomes both sort of hated and loved at the same time. And that ambivalence, he argued, made the capacity to move on from that loss much more difficult. And that's a very reductive kind of explanation, but I used this melancholic lens, and not only in that Freudian sense, but kind of inflected with feminist interpretations, but to analyse a particular focus group, this particular focus group discussion, in which I argued that these girls appear to be both full of love for what feminism offers them, but to also feel acute senses of loss and frustration for what it can't free them of. And I also argued that the experiences they have seem to leave them at an impasse. And it's interesting that we were just sort of talking in these terms in the last paper, but there's something where they seem to get really sort of stuck around how to feel empowered or agentic in their sexual encounters. But this is exactly the lens that I'm slightly throwing into question as well. So let's read the data extract. And I do just want to give a content warning because there are mentions of sexual violence from the girls in this data. So just a quick note before we read it. Faye starts the discussion, and this first comment that she says, this was made just in response to another comment that one of the girls had made about there being very little discussion of girls and women's pleasure and so much emphasis on boys and men's desire. So Faye says, friends will always ask, did he come? It's never, did you? You talk to so many girls of 16 or 17 and they'll always say he wasn't doing it right. But they'll never really say because they wouldn't want to make it like awkward and they don't feel like they have the right to say. And I say, right, well, we're also doing a disservice to boys by not teaching them about girls' bodies. They're learning from porn. And Faye says, yeah, they're rubbish. They're always like 0 to 100. That's from porn. Whereas a girl would be like, take it slow, do this and this. And they're just straight to the end of the spectrum of everything. Next slide, thanks. And I say, we have to counteract this because it's quite new that young people are learning about sex from these really hardcore videos, which aren't real at all. And Faye says, but you can see girls say, oh, he was really rough. Older girls or girls your age are the only ones who've done it. They say it hurts loads. And I say, you do all know now it's not meant to hurt. Next slide. Thank you. Vic says, it's not meant to. Why does everyone say it does? And I say, are you talking about the first time you have sex? And Vic says, yeah. And I say, okay, well, that might hurt a little bit. After that, it shouldn't hurt. And Vic says, everyone's like, oh, it hurts. And then the next slide, thanks. Faye says, yeah, and getting fingered. Vic says, yeah. Molly, that hurts so much. I say, that's not meant to hurt. Vic says, if the guy knows what he's doing, then it shouldn't hurt. Faye, but because of porn, they do it badly. Molly says, it's really sad. Some of the girls I know, there's one, she's 17, and she's had a couple of boyfriends. And the first one, he was really rough with her, and he made her bleed, and she cried, and he took it as a good sign. And Faye says, they weren't even having sex. Molly, that was him fingering her. She cried. Faye, the first time they did anything, he was like smacking her and pulling her hair and didn't ask her anything, just told her to take her clothes off. This is the last bit. Molly, I saw her recently and she was like, in retrospect, he was an absolute shit. But it's sad that she has to get onto the new one to realise it wasn't normal. She thought that was what was meant to happen. Faye, he's had 3 girlfriends and none of them thought I should tell him I don't want to be smacked. And Vic says, I'd tell him. Faye, but I find this, it's like the body positive thing, chill, you can get over that. But the next thing is, blah, I can't say anything or critique what a boy's doing. I find it harder than the body stuff. I crack that. But now I feel like being in a sexual environment with boys, much less empowered than I do about my body. In a weird way, I know that if I was advising someone else, I'd be like, tell him this and this and this and this. But then I never put it into practice. Okay, and so just to say that I can talk about that afterwards. Obviously, my role within that interview is very kind of different to my role in other interviews, and I analysed in my PhD how uncomfortable I felt afterwards about various things that I said or didn't say, and anyway, so that's kind of something to perhaps discuss later. So what I want to do is I just want to outline just a part of the analysis that I gave in my PhD that centres on this really melancholic interpretation where I'm emphasising the participants' kind of feminist consciousness, but that simultaneous sense of sexual disempowerment that I was arguing like produces this sort of heterosexualised feminist melancholia, as I called it. So one of the first aspects of this was a kind of ambivalence that I interpreted around what feminism can offer. So the participants' experiences of sexuality, as they kind of narrate in that extract, can be understood to form an ambivalent state. So the girls' engagement with feminism means that they're kind of able to question these systemic feminist issues around sexual violence and rape culture, and those were terms that they would use elsewhere. However, as Faye like explicitly states, they feel unable to bring this feminist awareness to their heterosexual encounters. And as you could see as well, there are many moments through that bit of data in which there's also a lot of not knowing and of questioning, and which speaks as well to the particular lack of sexuality education that they had in that school. So what I was arguing was that there was an ambivalence sort of constituted between their attachment to feminism's promise to them of empowerment and then its simultaneous sort of failure to protect them in these painful heterosexual encounters. So the other thing I was sort of interpreting was loss. So in those early comments by Faye, she discusses this sort of expectation for girls to talk about boys' sexual pleasure rather than girls being able to talk about their own pleasure. And in fact, a silence is alluded to. So like girls silence when boys have a lack of physical sensitivity to them. So Faye's comments are suggestive of sexual norms in which it's only boys' pleasures prioritised, girls' experiences of pain effectively goes like unspoken. And Deborah Tolman writes that adolescent girls are socialised to take up these norms, not to be disruptive, not to incite or engage in conflict, to, meet the needs of others at the expense of their own. And it's this that Faye seems to refer to, this sort of repeated script in which girls are compelled to remain quiet, even when in pain, in order to sort of protect boys' egos or feelings, to ensure the encounter doesn't become awkward. And when Faye talks about, when she starts with that question about did he come, she draws attention to a collective concern around boys' sexual satisfaction. And again, this kind of disregard around girls' pleasure. And the loss that I was interpreting really appeared to me at the time to be around a sense of their agentic or feminist sexual subjectivity that was almost seemed to be intensified due to their engagement with feminism at school, because there was a kind of impossibility about these heterosexual encounters that the engagement with feminism kind of made visible. So I thought that there was a kind of loss of an idealized feminism as well within that. And there was that. Oh, sorry, there's more I can say about that, but I'm just aware of time, so sorry, I'll keep going. I also was interpreting a painful sort of empath, and perhaps as a way, of dealing with some of my own discomfort around some of the comments that Faye was making about her friend's sexuality, because there's a kind of othering that goes on where they talk about like things that have happened to other girls, which perhaps is a way of not talking always about what happens to them. But anyway, I draw the topic outwards to wider issues of curriculum and pornography, and I comment on the lack of adequate sexuality education and porn. And Faye's response, rather than continuing to move that topic outside of her own experience, actually does bring it in and more directly states that boys are rubbish, she says, in sexual encounters, attributing their speed and like ignoring any of the directions from the girl they're with to what they see in porn. And then she references this much more kind of explicit violence in relation to boys causing girls pain and the girls' silences within those encounters. And this kind of, I interpreted a real permanence around, she uses terms like always quite a few times, like there is this sense of an inability to affect change around this, like a painful sense of incapacity for someone for whom feminism has otherwise offered so much, like for instance, around like body positivity, etc. So those were some of the interpretations I made, and again, like I'm having to be quite reductive about those, but that just gives you an idea. So next slide, please, Hannah. Thank you. So I recently started, as I said, to kind of question some of this melancholic thinking, and I've always found Jackson and Mazai really helpful with this, with their notion of kind of plugging into data, like what might it mean to plug in a different theory to this? Might there be something else that can be seen? And I think just like on a more methodological kind of level, really enjoy and are excited by this notion that data and theory are supple, that they can kind of interrupt and transform each other. So yeah, just to let you know, I'm kind of drawing on them. So this is some of the ways I'm starting to slightly rethink that section of that focus group. So next slide, please, Hannah. Thanks. So in 2019, Justin Greenidge, I read some of his work, and he was investigating how Black students in the US experience and contest racial trauma, using what he was terming racial melancholia. But his work really interestingly and politically disrupts that kind of good-bad binary around mourning and melancholia, because he argues that this reproduces what Eve Tuck calls damage-centered research. So in the racialized forms he was discussing it, he argued that these positions end up pathologizing communities of color, like trapping them within constant states of injury. And that got me thinking about what I was doing, what some of my interpretations of what the girls had said. So, and then the same year, next slide, please, Rosie Bridotti argued that in a world with increasing structural injustice and perennial warfare, there's a politics of melancholia that she argued has become so dominant that it functions like a self-fulfilling prophecy, leaving very small margins for alternative approaches. And she argued for the need to experiment with other responses, almost as a moral imperative. And she called this an ethics of affirmation, the belief that kind of negative affects can be transformed, the notion that every event contains within it the potential for being overcome and overtaken, potentially into productive forms of resistance. So next slide, please. So these ideas really got me thinking about this particularly melancholic interpretation I made, in which I'm kind of arguing that the girls can't kind of get past what feminism appears not to offer them. It can't, this sense that they can't be sort of like feminism won't protect them. But I started wondering, is this interpretation rather an impasse in itself? Is it leaving little room for transformation or change or resistance? And this relates to me and my own subjectivity as well, partly within that group space, but also as a feminist, self-identified kind of feminist researcher, a feminist educator, somebody who's worked extensively with feminism groups in schools to encourage activisms, encourage community. And then I just wondered if that empaths I was interpreting somewhat overemphasized pain and suffering, despite the fact they're discussing pain, but that I lost sight of what their discussion and its affects might enable that's more potentially transformative and resistant. So through kind of replugging into the girls' narratives, which is something I'm sort of working on at the moment, I'm now questioning how these melancholic interpretations might be rethought, and not just as a methodological kind of academic exercise, but to begin working at how interpretations might avoid falling into an impasse through both trying to stay with the trouble, as Haraway puts it, of loss and pain and sexual violence, whilst also being open to the possibility of affirmative feminisms in schools. So just to kind of begin to finish, next slide, please, Hannah. I'm just starting to, these are some of the questions I've been posing, and I'll just show you a few things that have been sort of coming out of this. So if we plug in a more dynamic and affirmative view, I'm wondering what negative affects in this data might be transformed, what about what we see here might be overcome or overtaken. And I suppose a bigger, much broader question is around the political ethics of how we interpret our data. So these are just a couple of things that have come out for me. Next slide, thank you. So Cheng writes about there sometimes being a shift from suffering to speaking out. They write, we see a shift from suffering injury to speaking out against that injury. And that's something, of course, that was going on within that feminism group. They've suffered various injuries, if we want to put it in those terms, but even within that feminist group space, there's an articulation and a questioning of those injuries that could be argued to be much more powerful than perhaps I interpreted it in my thesis. So, like Faye's capacity to actually articulate the ambivalence and the complexity of all of this, the way in which the feminist focus group space was sort of acting as a container for some of that those kind of melancholic feelings or those injuries to be spoken and worked with. And actually to have a space in which young people are meandering into territories in which they feel able to admit to feelings of hopelessness and to be able to talk these through. Is something I'd like to explore further. And also there's something around the formation of solidarities and communities of care, which have been discussed earlier today. But for instance, like Gilroy, Butler, Braidotti, they've all argued for the productive nature of melancholia, its potential for creating solidarities. And Braidotti actually writes that she's convinced that melancholia enables these identifications between people with the wounds of others, and it can promote senses of belonging by upholding collective experiences of pain and memories of pain, she writes. And I wondered if we perhaps see this as, again, like this focus group or the feminist group space, and there's a slippage between the focus group and the feminist group here. But we're enabling kind of intersubjective connections between the participants as they related to each other in community. So I'm thinking about all of this, and I'll stop there. But as you can see, lots of this is kind of still running through me. But thank you very much, and thank you, Hannah, for dealing with all the slides for me. Thank you.
This grew out of some questions that I was beginning to ask as a result of our girls' relationships with particularly role model discourses, but actually resonates back through all my research, starting with my PhD 12 years ago. So it's really kind of 4 projects where they've not been projects themselves about role models, but where the concept of the role model is consistently raised. And these were projects that looked at the idea of the highly successful, the achieving the alpha girl, girls that looked projects that looked very specifically at women leaders, projects that looked at women in STEM and sort of women in politics. So and what this led me back to, and particularly this interest in the popularity of the narrative of the role model. which is kind of having a moment. It's like, I don't know, cauliflower on Pinterest, it's just having a recipe moment. The role model seems to be everywhere. You can find it in all kinds of websites, news stories, etc., and particularly pertaining to girls. And I got very interested in this role model from kind of a political economy's point of view and from a gender discursive point of view. And as I was reading back on it and where the concept comes from, surprised to find it very poorly defined in both psychology and sociology. Where it is better defined is through kind of critical work. But what's kind of got left behind, and what I want to kind of, a term I'm sort of trying to not reinstate, I don't think it's ever got away, is the idea of the reference group, because these two things, the sociological theory in the mid-20th century, went hand in hand. But the idea of the reference group has got very much left behind. Nobody is calling, perhaps it sounds less immediately obvious what it's meant. Nobody is calling for girls need more reference groups. Everybody's saying girls need more role models. So a notable feature of the 21st century mediascape is the call for more prominent role models as identificatory figures for girls as a solution to a whole range of gendered inequalities in STEM, in powerful and prominent roles in leadership. And as noted by scholars of girlhood, this kind of agentic future girl has emerged as a key emblem of both social mobility for the individual and social change. And I think both the role model and the future girl are very much symptomatic of neoliberalism's appropriation of kind of feminism and common sense notions. Who would be against role models? Who would be against more women leaders or more women in STEM on television? But actually repurposing these notions as this kind of buttress for individualism and self-responsibility at a time, or as it is responsible for the removal of material structures for well-being and economic thriving, that discourses of the role model place the responsibility for thriving onto the individual, and the role model becomes the resource for that, and it's a very cheap resource. So it's also, I think, symptomatic of an increasing awareness of the failures of neoliberalism. We've got looming crises in climates, the market failed, we've got world poverty, all growing out of this unbridled free market. And it's brought about this new sense of kind of inclusive capitalism, the idea that we can kind of keep the capitalist baby and throw away some of the bathwater through bringing in this new private sector-based approach that is going to promise profitability at the same time as delivering fairness. And the woman leader is kind of culturally endowed with all these qualities that particularly fit her to lead this kind of inclusive capitalism, to lead these new corporations, which will be kind of better tuned to the equality, will have a better kind of relational awareness. Because women have these kind of essentialized qualities in the public domain of empathy, inclusivity, and connection. And these are partly, as Hannah and I argue, partly brought about through the disasters of things like the 2008 financial crash. We look at kind of COVID. We get this Lehman Sisters hypothesis. If the Lehman brothers had been the Lehman sisters, the crash wouldn't have happened because women are too responsible to allow it to happen. And what we have emerging from that is this blending with really the discourse of the girl as the future saviour, the future girl, the girl who can bring it all together and make it happen. I've become very interested in this, mapping it onto, for example, theological discourses of the Christa, superhero discourses in popular culture around, if we think of things like The Last of Us or Heroes, you know, the figure of the saviour girl. So it's not just that women are going to be the best leaders. We're projecting onto the girl this idea that they are going to save humankind from disaster, so that the kind of apotheosis of the future girl is the saviour girl, because she is going to save humanity. And this role model discourse also dovetails very well with this kind of 20th century psychologization of girlhood, which again marries well, I think, Angela McRobbie has argued, Sarah Bailey-Weiser has argued, this idea by focusing on the individual girl and the ills that society creates for her and how we can make her more resilient. It's a highly individualizing discourse, and it makes specific demands of the girl subject in terms of the imaginative labor that she has to undertake, her entrepreneurship, her identity work, kind of molding her subjectivity along the axis of aspiration. I was very interested when you were talking, Hannah, about how girls were at the same time as recognizing the hurts caused by their experiences, were assuming responsibility for not speaking up. And I think this is very typical of this pattern of popular feminism, which, unlike McRobbie's post-feminist contract, allows for the recognition of inequality, but what it doesn't provide is any kind of collective response. The response is always to be found within the individual girl, kind of adjusting her kind of confidence, gaining her voice. So what I think sort of role models discourse do is it kind of it decontextualize the role model, the highly prominent, the highly visible figure of the successful woman from her social and cultural reference groups. Other than gender, it's this idea of, you know, she can see it, she can be it. If I see a woman doing this, then I too can do it. It's this very, very oversimplified concept of gender matching that kind of dislocates the girl subject from the community. That's what the role model does, even as it interpolates her. So differences between the role model and the reference group, just to if anybody I didn't do sociology, I did an English literature degree, so this was all kind of new to me while I was reading it. So we've got the idea of the role model is very kind of culturally familiar. If you ask people on the street, what's a role model? When I go around and talk to girls, what do you think a role model is? They have an answer. If I were to ask them what a reference group is, they'd have no idea. So while the reference group is this kind of group that's used as a kind of standard for self-reflection, either kind of conscious or unconscious, and it's always a group, a collective. It could be age peers, it could be religious groups, it could be a social class, but it provides a kind of benchmarks for our values and norms and behaviour. While the role model entails individual identification, the reference group involves a kind of comparison of the Seltzer group norms, but also a comparison of the groups of which one is a member with the groups of which one isn't. And so the role model exerts an influence which is highly individualized and psychologized and requires labor on the behalf of the individual. What the reference group does is much more kind of norm-based and structural. It requires a social and economic investment to effect change. Merton, one of the originators of the reference group theory, introduces the idea of relative deprivation. Your group has more than my group. I'm going to start some collective action to get some of what your group has had. What some of your group has. What Lorna Finlayson, whose wonderful Third Shift, looking at, you know, why representation is not enough, argues very specifically is about the way that neoliberalism has stripped away that social and economic investment. So the things which would give girls the opportunity to engage with those with reference groups outside of the home, those things are no longer there. And I was at an event with the social geographer Danny Dorling last year, and he came in and said, "Oh, I've just been to a funeral, and it was for a woman who was an activist in the 70s." And he said the problem is that all the good social structures that we have, the community centres, the mother and baby groups, all of these were put into place by women in the 70s, and they're all being stripped away, and all those women who did them are dying. They're all of that age, and there is nothing as yet to replace it. And this, was one of the sparks that got me interested in this. And this is one of the others. So this was just before COVID, where one of my great nieces, I have greats, I'm feeling the weight of generations there, was telling me about how she knew the sort of work that I was doing. Hannah and I were working on an article on role models, and she told me that her school had put up a poster of Michelle Obama with a quote that's become quite kind of well known: "Whether you come from a council estate or a country estate, your success will be determined by your own confidence and fortitude." Now, the same day that she told me that, there was a story on the news about Jacob Rees-Mogg. For non-UK members, he's a highly elite cabinet member of the last government, had taken his son, one of his children, to Chequers, which is the summer residence of the Prime Minister of England, where all these key political decisions and manoeuvrings happen. And I thought, well, that's really what a role model does. It's not having a picture of Michelle Obama on your wall and thinking I can do that. It's having a dad who's a member of the cabinet and getting to go to Chequers with him. And I thought this is where we get the sense of the difference of those kinds of operations. And what I've become interested in is the difference of the role model in kind of critical studies versus the public imaginary. And one of the things that I've become very surprised about is how often role model discourse just slips under the radar. If you look in management studies, if you look in education, if you look at stuff which is highly critical in terms of gender inequalities, there's not that much criticality around the ideal of the role model. The idea is that it's an accepted concept, which is very kind of taken for granted. And actually, when you dig into it, you can find that there's actually very, very little psychological or sociological explanation for how role models actually work. In the same way, nobody's really worked out how media identification works. Is it technological? Is it sociological? Is it internal and psychological? There's the tension between the two of individualism and collectivism, which I've talked about. But also, it seems to me that the difference between reference group and role models is also a difference between media effects, which is, that very contentious idea that media can have direct and measurable effects on individuals, but is usually rolled out to do with groups that are more kind of culturally powerless. So girls, the working classes, the masses. We never find, people worrying about Eton schoolboys being affected too much by the media, versus the idea of media enculturation. And I think, again, going back to the Obama and Rees-Mogg, a role model is the neoliberal darling narrative because it prompts individual aspiration. What a reference group does is give you a sense of entitlement. And I mean that not as an insult. It's that if I am around, it's the same way that, the children of doctors become doctors. If I'm around politics, I'm more likely to become a politician. And whereas the role model is about that very neoliberal New Labour discourse of equality of opportunity, it's up to the individual to take advantage of. The reference group is very much about equity. Do I have access to this group, to that familiarity, to that enculturation into those particular roles? So I've kind of talked about these a little bit, so I'm going to skip over that slide. So I'm just going to go into some data now, into thinking about how are girls thinking about these kinds of concepts. So these are just some quotations from mine and Hannah's data. So very much there's a very strong buy-in to this idea of merit and aspiration and self-determination. Girls can run the world if you want to. It's an issue of confidence. Confidence was the huge C word in our research. But that exists in the same way that in Hannah's research, we were talking about those kind of, very much there's an awareness of the self as allegedly empowered, but in the face of structural barriers. Girls were very aware of the barriers associated with class, associated with race, associated with accent. So cadence, we've got people from posh areas, they have all this opportunity that you don't necessarily get if you're from Bradford. There is a strong sense of the intersectional risks of exceptionality and visibility. And what I haven't talked about, but which is forming part of the proposal we'll look at the moment, is the idea is that the role model only works because of inadequacy and exceptionality. You never get a call for role models. Nobody's calling for more male bankers or more male doctors. It's the idea of exceptionality that makes the role model, gives the role model its power and visibility. The exceptionality increases along intersectional axes, but the risks of visibility also increase. So Toya, who's a black girl, was talking about very much the risks that kind of the kind of awareness that black girls develop very, very young, and this sense that all women have of being scared of being visible at the same time as being obliged to be visible. But also emerging alongside that is this sense of the collective power and safety of the reference group. And it was very interesting that the reference groups that were most often mentioned were either were historical, the suffragettes, or were sports related. You had sports teams, dance troupes, and the suffragettes. There's very little else outside that, which prompted mine and Hannah's course, which I haven't got time to talk about it. So other issues that came up from our girls was the idea that gender matching is not enough. One of the calls for girls was more gender neutral role models, the idea that a role should not be associated with a certain gender. So there's no point just providing an oppositional discourse. Can we not get rid of both the oppositions? One of the distinctions that girls made, which I thought was very interesting, was the idea of the model as distinct from the role. is they felt they had plenty of models, plenty of celebrities, plenty of prominent figures, but they couldn't explain the role. Michelle Obama couldn't explain to them how you get from going from a council of state to having political power. Didn't mean they didn't agree that role models had particularly media role models and celebrity, that they felt they had an important function in terms of providing inspiration, in terms of prompting certain kinds of emotional attachment and demonstrating possibility. But they also had a great awareness of what Lauren Berlant calls cruel attachment. This idea is it attaches you to what you see as a future possibility, which is actually cruel because it's not a possibility for you at all. Sorry, my computer's just telling me it wants to restart and I really don't want it to. But also a call for local references for enabling learning and doing. More girls talk about local figures, their teachers, their mothers, their aunts, people in their community, are those that they learn from. They're very aware of the disparity of exposure and propinquity. Sorry, I've got a typo on there. So they are aware that some young people get access to all kinds of systems, clubs, groups that they don't. And they're also very determined to choose their own role models. I mean, for example, the adult distinction between celebrity and politician it just didn't exist for girls. So that's where we've got in terms of data. How am I doing for time, Hannah?
Fine, yeah.
Oh, good, okay. So what I'm beginning to look at now, as I'm mapping this out, is who and what are girls' reference groups? Can we identify them? Do they exist? Did they exist in the past? They vanished in the ways that ones Danny Dorling describes, or if not, do they exist online? Which is why I'm very interested in the things that Hannah Yelin was saying and Gilly was saying about this kind of the notion of the collective, but also the depoliticized collective. You know, the limits of that of the transferal of the notion of collective action from an offline to an online phenomenon. Where is the compelling public discourse around them? Because I don't think that exists in the public imaginary at the moment. You know, what Foucault says kind of sits in between library books and university reports and whatever. They're kind of taken for granted assumptions. And if we haven't got them, how do we get them? And I've put a kind of back around them because I think, and this is a personal perception, but there is some evidence, there were more systems and structures in place before 2008 for girls to get involved actively in their communities than there are now. So that's really where I've got to in my thinking on that, and I can expand on any aspect of that. It's been a bit of downhill ice slalom.
So in the title of the paper, it says, I'm interested here in community spaces of learning and intergenerational exchange, and that intergenerational exchange is probably at the center. I will be talking a lot about representatives of older generations and also probably younger generations than the age group we've been talking so far, and also the question of digital labor. I would like to go more into that direction of care and technologies, technologies of care, but rather that appropriation and renegotiation of the hegemonic digital infrastructure that is there and how that is navigated in terms of a politics of care and community. What I'm using as kind of concepts to think this through is spaces that are very particular to Caribbean Carnival. Caribbean Carnival is a transnational festival and space. That would be, for example, the Mass Camp, where costumes are being made. As a community space, the pan yard where steel pans are being played, people are performing, while it is also a space of encounter of different generations, and also a lot of different activities happening there. The Calypso tent would be another one, but I'll leave that out for now. To give you an impression how this is looking in a Caribbean context, I want to show you a short extract from a documentary series that is produced by a young filmmaker, Shari Petty. She was artist in residence last year at Oxford Brookes, and also presented some of these episodes of her documentary series, which is called Mass Prep. So it is focusing on how mass, short for masquerade, how these mass camps that are focusing on a particular traditional mass character, what kind of sociality comes out of this. And it very specifically also shows how learning functions in intergenerational encounter. Why I showed this is, as I said, first of all, it does give a very good impression of how the making is very much a part of the knowledge transfer, the skills development, and so on. But it's also because of, obviously, the mass character in question, which is the Mukojombi, and how that relates to history, storytelling, and basically encapsulating the history of the Middle Passage. And the resilience, the continuation of Caribbeanness and Caribbean identity. So again, this is set in Trinidad. It's just important to kind of understand that Caribbean Carnival is a very fluid space. It is a transnational space where, let me just see if I can do the slideshow. Where we have these transnational media circuits. We have the season starting with Carnival in Trinidad, a lot of soca songs being released, the diasporic community joining in either in person or through various platforms that are available, and where this continuous flow is happening. Obviously, when the pandemic hit and lockdowns were imposed, this was an incredible challenge for practitioners to deal with. It was not the first time that Carnival, for example, in Trinidad was cancelled due to external forces. And you could see that creative explosion of ways to still connect through digital media, where all the formats like online radio stations or other platforms on Instagram with artist Vibes with Voice would be an example, kind of continued or were boosted through this, but also new formats like a Zoom Fete, a Zoom party basically happening. We had the TikTok challenges of people putting on their costume that they couldn't perform on the road, in the parade, and performing or playing it in their living room. So this was all happening all across the Caribbean Carnival sphere. In the UK, very specifically, Notting Hill Carnival as the largest carnival in the country, they launched a program that was called Access All Areas. And it was live shows combined with pre-recorded performances that were streamed widely. What we did in our research, my colleague Micah Gugulato, who I mentioned, was immediately after this, or the year after, we interviewed organizers and producers about their experience of this kind of enforced digitalization. And from these interviews emerged a very strong sense of digital media being used for documentation and archiving. And the pandemic was, in that sense, despite all these difficulties, and especially also financial and organizational issues that arose, was a time to rethink how this could be done, and also having some funding available to do this. So there was this potential for education to the wider public, but also to community members. And it's kind of interesting to see that shared sense in all the interviews about this lack of knowledge, and also how this results in a threat to Carnival as it is and to its art forms due to, for example, traditional masquerade, as we've seen in that short documentary, not being considered, not being respected, and not having the means to upkeep these creative practices. Right. So just to see how that differed in terms of the organizations and what they managed to do, Notting Hill Carnival very successfully launched their arts and culture Google page, which had photo exhibitions. Going into the archives, it had rich resources explaining traditional masquerade, interviews with contemporary artists, and also some of the elders who had this chance to document some of their practices and share it. One of the key challenges was, sorry about the blurry image here, was that the documentaries that the producers felt depicted carnival arts in a in a very valuable way, did not reach the audiences that they had hoped for. What was quite successful in terms of outreach was, for example, this clip produced by Samsung, and, for example, other media and content that was produced by Spotify in that scenario of the 2020 Notting Hill Carnival. And obviously, we could talk about how the positioning, the platform architecture, algorithmic culture, and so on, works in privileging content that, as we can see here, although it is blurry, definitely in terms of the objectified, hypersexualized, and often racialized spectacle, the excess behind it, the multisensory overload and experience that was emphasized. And that is also very much beyond the pandemic, an issue that content creators are facing. So I was using Annemiek Zaha's concept of technology of racialized governmentalities in this context to kind of look at how commodification works in this context. Now, coming to the experiences of the producers, and this is usually members of the community with quite a lot of experience in terms of generational, not always, but rather older generations, and how they perceived this change or this shift towards the digital. And Matthew Phillips, for example, from Notting Hill Carnival, saw it in a very positive light. He said, if we can embrace in terms of the lessons we've learned about filming and things like that, the purchase of cameras, we have a lot of the equipment ourselves now. If we can use that and record and film things at high quality, it can only get better and better. So there is a sense of the challenges, but it looks very different with smaller organizations. And here's Roz Alexander of Yukon Careers saying, reflecting on the experience of moving the Barking and Dagenham Carnival online. And she says it was an absolutely horrendous experience, but we learned a lot out of it. Horrendous is in the process of going through it, but the outcomes were amazing. We achieved everything that we wanted to achieve, and then we learned that we can actually deliver it online now. In the second part, when she continues to reflect, you can see how the intergenerational relationships are at the core of this. So this organization relies a lot on volunteers, on voluntary work, and it is very difficult in terms of the inequality or unequal distribution of skills and access to equipment to actually make this happen. So although she does not directly mention this, but she focuses on, for example, not being able to give the guidance of not being in that position, that you have the skills to show them how to do that bit. I mean, the volunteers as well as the young participants who they're working with. Just what I forgot to mention, Yukon Careers is very much focused on young people and their learning through and skills development through Caribbean Carnival art forms. Right, so that is kind of where this idea then came from, of looking a bit more into these spaces of learning and how these relationships then also translate into different spaces. And I'm just going to take you through a short journey now. And that's where you see that this is not very developed at all, and it's kind of more reflecting on my own role and experience doing the research when I looked into live streaming and how that digitalization during the pandemic kind of had an impact on later years. So what you can see here is a mass camp in Hackney that was very close in terms of my neighborhood. And the name of the mass band is Tropical Isles. At that particular year in 2023, their theme was the Woman King. They were looking at this quite big production as an inspiration. And this is where mass bands start to work right after Carnival ends on a theme for the next year. Then comes costume design, then comes involvement of members and participants come in there, paying a lot of money for costumes. Some of the larger costumes are about £250 to £300. That's just something to keep in mind, very often misrepresented in media, and younger members being able to play mass under much better conditions. Right, so when it comes to learning and the role of young people, and here very young people, this is my daughter, she's 2 years old at the time, and you move into this mass camp where these costumes are set up, where making is in the process almost all the time. And you have this 2-year-old, obviously, face lighting up at the prospect of touching everything and having boxes upon boxes filled with gems and shiny stuff. Me breaking into sweat, obviously. But then the mass leader saying you can touch everything as long as you don't move it or you put it back after you have used it. So she was delighted while we were taking a tour looking at some of the costumes here. What happened at the same time in a different room of the mass camp was a summer camp for children from the neighborhood, from across Hackney, also students at schools who have access to free school meals. They go free for the camp. So there were around 40 kids, and they were all immersed in various activities, some of them very typical, building Lego designs, or here Play-Doh and so on. But some of them very specifically focusing on carnival arts, on costume making, performance, also inviting them to play mass. And that is where this particular mass band has been very successful in recruiting young members to join them, also funding their participation in Carnival, and that is Notting Hill Carnival as well as Hackney Carnival, which might not come back, but at the time was still part of the yearly schedule. And you can see how the young members of the Carnival camp move over to this mass camp now, where the costumes are being made, their conversations about the costumes, what they mean, what they have learned in the previous days. Here you see the daughter of the mass leader talking about The Woman King and the film, and who had seen it, some of them mentioning they watched it with their parents because they were inspired, seeing that this is this year's theme. And they were talking about women and their role, and just thinking about role model and so on. Some of these obviously very dominant narratives of empowerment and so on had their place there as well. And then from there, we are moving to the road. This is Carnival Sunday in Notting Hill in the morning, preparing the truck and getting ready to go on the parade. One of the key experiences of a lot of people with Notting Hill Carnival is basically not seeing the parade or not enough of it. So playing with a mass band is very much staying in motion, but with the band and the truck that continuously plays music, has different DJs providing that. You can see children being part of this and different generations kind of exchanging the road as a space of learning as well. For example, you can see older members of the band here showing certain dance moves, but also fixing costumes. There is a sense of care and community in that space. You can see very, again, 2-year-old watching the dance performance, the choreography that is practiced and performed. And here at the end, this is a different setting. This is not Notting Hill Carnival, but Carnival Roadshow, it was called in Hackney, when the carnival didn't return to the street, but rather was in a more contained space. Nevertheless, there was a kind of stage setting that would usually be the judging point where the group could perform their choreography. And what is interesting here, and this is where essentially my interest comes in terms of media practices, in terms of also this sense of care and community, where you see this ring of people, and it is parents, it is members, particularly of this group, but also of the wider carnival community. There is a lot of recording happening. There is a lot of cameras around that children and young people are very aware of. And there is a lot of sharing of that content. And I think that is where that, also in terms of digital practices and that kind of ethics of care, where there is a sense of protection, where young people can explore their dance moves, can explore this performance display as well that is so much as subjected to a racial white gaze in dominant media, where these protective spaces are built, and continuously that labor goes in from different representatives of the group and different generations. But so this is just the idea, kind of what I wanted to explore, and that I shared probably very prematurely, and hoping to explore further. And I'll stop here.
Hello there, I'm Steve Roberts, Professor of Sociology at Monash University here in Melbourne. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I am broadcasting from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And they are the traditional custodians of the land, airs and waters where I live and work, sovereignty never ceded. So today I'm presenting findings from the latest phase of ongoing work that I'm doing with my co-lead and colleague Stephanie Westcott, where we examine the resurgence of misogynistic behaviour among boys in Australian schools in the context of the manosphere. In particular, the data that I'm going to talk about today comes from more than 100 teacher testimonies from a qualitative survey that we conducted here in Australia. And this data indicates we think that digitally inflected masculinities are being enacted offline through what we are calling reanimated manhood acts. These are gendered performances that assert power, they police boundaries and express backlash in material contexts with very material outcomes for women and girls and people of other genders. So let me get into this. Okay, let's begin with the context. So basically, the proliferation of sexist behavior among boys across public, Catholic, and independent schools has become a serious concern. And whilst it has become a serious concern, I guess it's always important to stress that despite the kind of recent media attention that draws our eye to these things, we also have to recognize that scholars like Kerry Robinson and Amanda Keddy and many others outside the Australian context remind us that this issue is long-standing. Sexism in schools has been around for a long, long time. But what's different now is perhaps how these behaviors manifest. As one teacher described, as you will see more and more of this as I work my way through, like it seems worse than ever. This is a common refrain. So teachers describe an emboldened misogyny, more public, more hostile, and often expressed with an apparent sense of impunity for boys and young men. And okay, so a key driver of this kind of new misogyny, if you like, is the manosphere. So this loosely connected digital ecosystem of actors and spaces that promote anti-feminist and hypermasculine ideology that Debbie Ging especially has written about extensively, but also increasingly many more people have written about this at length as well. And what we wanted to do is draw some connections between our research and the manosphere. So our research interviewing women teachers. Qualitatively interviewing women teachers, we observed how Andrew Tate in particular, his rhetoric had entered classrooms. So boys were echoing his talking points, they were mocking women teachers in ways where they used Tate's language and mannerisms and challenging authority with an increasing sense of impunity, as I mentioned before. And this like parallels some things we've seen in other research as well, who don't necessarily focus on teachers per se, which I think is where our work was slightly unique, but other research, particularly Craig Haslop and Jessica Ringrose and Tanya Horek and other scholars in the UK, but Samantha Schultz here in Australia as well, have all written papers that demonstrate that there is an influence of Andrew Tate and the manosphere, and it's not just this kind of abstract, but it's behavioral. And I guess to underscore what happens, what we observe in our research is that teachers hear Tate's ideas echoed in playground banter, in classroom taunts, in subtle acts of resistance, which are things I'll unpack a bit more when I get to the latest data. But yeah, I suppose again, what ours and other research alludes to is this kind of not a return to traditional sexism per se, but a kind of new misogyny, one that's more unapologetic, more digitally amplified and politically emboldened. And we do take some risks there, I understand, with thinking that it is somewhat different to traditional sexism, but it's as we walk through the data, I think we point to something that is new in its formation, or refined and different in its formation, if not entirely new in terms of its outcomes. But basically what we're saying is that this is shaped by the backlash to the Me Too movement, the increased reality of a post-truth culture, and the corresponding rise of populist far-right ideologies that cast feminism as a threat, which have been there previously, but now seem much more prominent. So it's about the misogyny that emerges within that context and emerges because of that context. And I suppose another thing to kind of underscore is that we understand this is not just a cultural undercurrent, but a structural backlash that makes the most of what Sarah Banet-Weiser describes as networked misogyny. So the key here is that these digital spaces are not contained. Their influence bleed into the classrooms, into lunchrooms and staff meetings and playgrounds and so on. And at least to some extent, the digital spaces are teaching boys how to, or informing boys about the possibilities for performing masculinity in very misogynistic ways, both individually and collectively, in real life. And other things that we've discussed in our own writing, as well as the way that schools, unfortunately, are not neutral in this endeavor. And in our papers in British Journal of Sociology of Education and Critical Studies in Education, we've also argued that school leaders, at least some school leaders, engage in institutional gaslighting, so the downplaying or ignoring of reports of gendered violence and harassment, and that essentially some educators are punished for raising concerns in this respect. Some are left to manage their own abuse and are kind of abandoned by the system. But also, more than this, we maybe provocatively, but I think perhaps in this audience will be something that you may be sympathetic to, but an argument, again, in Critical Studies of Education in our paper, that we suggest that the very fabric of schools as institutions gives rise to this violence. And you can read more about that in the papers that I've listed on the slide here. Don't have time to go through it, but yeah, please feel free to read those papers. And again, so I suppose what we're trying to get at here is in this context, in the context of institutions that are embedded and have violence built in, the possibility for violence built into the very fabric of these institutions. In this context, the manosphere doesn't just kind of infiltrate, it flourishes, it exploits institutional silences to legitimize the worldviews that are being put forward by the manosphere actors. So our latest study then, what we've done is analyzed 107 qualitative teacher testimonies that we gathered via an online survey. Originally, there were 112, but once we cleaned the data and we found basically 107 usable pieces of content. And the survey was based on two open-ended prompts. One of them, and the one that I'm using today, the prompt is, tell us what you've seen or experienced in your career relating to sexism in schools. The other one that we're not using today asked about a specific curriculum in Australia known as respectful relationships education. So we just focused on that first one. And I suppose I'd say that the unstructured format of the survey, just allowing people to write their views and feelings and experiences, this means that teachers could speak to what mattered most to them without the kind of intervention of the researcher. It allowed for narrative and critical depth, basically effective depth. The participants were teachers, as I say, but with varying levels of experience. Around a third of them had 15 years or more in the profession, and the rest were kind of distributed fairly evenly across those with 10 to 15, 5 to 10, and 1 to 5 years of experience is how we measured them. More than 70, just over 70% of them were based here in Victoria, but then scattered around the other states as well, a quarter in Queensland, and then 12% in New South Wales, and a small number from South Australia and the Australian Capital Territory and Tasmania. Most of the participants by far identified as women, so 85%, and then there was a small number of men, around 10% of people, and 4 or 5% of non-binary or genderqueer participants. And most of them described themselves as white or Caucasian, with very limited representation from Asian backgrounds, Indigenous backgrounds, and other groups. And it effectively kind of represents or reflects the broader lack of diversity in Australia's teaching workforce, which is a kind of crisis and a separate crisis in of itself. And one thing before we get to the main data for this paper, for this presentation, is that across the responses, I'm going to say this before I even get to the conceptual framework, but I just want to kind of underscore this repeatedly, that across the responses, teachers tell us something has changed. So again, reflecting on this idea of a new misogyny, some of them pointed to kind of post-COVID return to classrooms. And here in Australia, the COVID lockdown was exceptionally long and very different to many parts of the world. Others talk about the mainstreaming of manosphere rhetoric, but basically almost all of them described a noticeable escalation from around 2021 onwards. Whether or not that's kind of discursive or otherwise is in some ways neither here nor there, but there's a sense of like, this is different, something has changed. So conceptually, what we're doing in this paper is trying to make sense of the behaviors that the teachers tell us they observe and experience through the application of Schrock and Schwab's concept of manhood acts. And I guess in short, if Connell's conceptualization of hegemonic masculinity explains which forms of masculinity dominate and how institutions like education, the media, and law and so on, how these help sustain men's power. In contrast, manhood acts brings us down a level. It focuses on the everyday performances through which masculinity is enacted and maintained as a socially achieved identity. And given the idea of manhood acts is rooted in symbolic interactionism and building on Weston Zimmerman's work on doing gender, it's probably no surprise then that manhood acts are kind of they're understood as being intentional and situational and interactional. And these acts, and we might think of things here like as interrupting at the lower end, mocking as we start to move up the end of towards greater severity, harassing women and gender diverse peers. These are ways that boys and men claim privilege and elicit deference. And crucially, what manhood acts are kind of try to show us, or scholars try to show through the focus on manhood acts, is that hegemonic masculinity is not just structural, but continually reproduced through behaviors. So if hegemonic masculinity tells us who holds the power, manhood acts reveals how power is performed, how it's reinforced, how it's made real in everyday settings, and in our case, in school settings. And what happens then is and it kind of does this in ways that assert dominance, demand deference, and police gender boundaries. So while manhood acts has helped us understand how masculinity is performed in everyday contexts and everyday interactions, there's later work that's built upon that early 2009 work to extend this into the online world. And really very prominent here has been the work of Maloney and Love, especially their concept of virtual manhood acts, which is seen by the field as a kind of a really important step forward. And the work that they did stems from an analysis of many, many thousands of online responses to a celebrity nude photo leak. And as part of that process, they identified 4 recurring behaviors that they called virtual manhood acts. So they talked about how the online users set about creating male-dominated online spaces that exclude women and queer people. They talked about how they go about sexualizing women through unauthorized image sharing, through asserting heterosexuality, and then fourthly, through using humor to dismiss harm and entrench sexism. And these insights were really helpful to give us a grasp of how masculinity plays out in digital context, or to conceptualize how this happens, particularly, these spaces where anonymity, especially, and a supposed distance of sorts enables behaviors that might not necessarily surface in the offline world. That's kind of the argument, that there was a distinction between the two. In this paper that I'm presenting today, we kind of play with the boundary there a little bit and ask us to kind of think about or pay attention to how in classrooms, in corridors, and playgrounds today, many of these same dynamics that are described in online settings are actually happening more and more and playing out face to face. So the boldness and frequency of these behaviors is kind of pointing to that what was once felt unique or very recently was kind of described as that's the online space, that's a virtual manhood act, and it's somehow distinct. What we're now seeing is that these have been reanimated in physical settings and often without restraint. So drawn directly from teachers' testimonies, we suggest there are 5 what we call reanimated manhood acts that are at play here, and each reflects a performance of power, of identity, and belonging. And of course, as you'll see as I move through them, these 5 manhood acts, we there's a degree of overlap, and we recognize that they're an imperfect kind of conceptual model, but hopefully they work as kind of broad, rough constellations to get at what's actually happening in terms of an overall, constellation of acts, I suppose. So firstly, we have backlash misogyny. So backlash to gender equality is a central driving force, driving renewed manhood acts in schools. And what we're kind of getting at here is that within this landscape, popular feminism and popular misogyny are kind of embedded and they're seen as adversarial. And the classroom then becomes a stage, and I think Bane Weiser and her colleague Higgins, whose first name I forget, they call this the economy of visibility. So where boys perform recognizable masculinity through acts of provocation, and you see this a lot in the first couple of quotes on the left-hand side here. So this first teacher is reflecting on when a boy says, just trying to engage her, like, do you know Andrew Tate? They say things like, women need men to protect them. And a young student at just grade 4 is writing 2468, I love Andrew Tate. And so the comments on one hand are kind of mimicry, but we would like to push that a bit further and think of them as manhood acts. So they're ritualized assertions of power that use anti-feminist talking points to reestablish gender dominance, which seems like a big claim for stuff that is even written and said by small boys. But again, this is a collective in lots of ways. A significant minority, not all boys, but a significant minority that are engaging in this kind of behavior. And that's at the one end of the scale. This kind of engaging women teachers in a way that's particularly kind of adversarial, but subtly still. And then at the other end, as the third comment in this first box alludes, alongside this stuff, there's things that seem a bit more mundane, but then there's things that are utterly disgusting. And I'm not going to read out the comment, but I leave it here because the hatred in the language is powerful and telling and quite disturbing. But I think shying away from that truth is we don't do justice to the person that gave this story. So here it is. In the second box here, this is where we get to talking about how teachers also describe boys making direct sexualized noises or slurs during respectful relationship classes or on International Women's Day. So they're kind of, this teacher, T26, is saying they laugh when we start asking what's problematic. They yell transphobic and homophobic slurs. They said it was within their rights. And what's happening here, and the other data that we kind of work through in the paper, is that these patterns reflect what we think is a growing confidence and a growing ideological confidence or confidence in ideology among boys. We're challenging feminist thought, we're challenging gender equality, we're challenging progress as a route to recognition rather than discipline. And this overlaps with something that I'll say later. But also, rather than kind of isolated incidents, these are scripted, almost scripted. They feel scripted in lots of ways, but they're collective expressions of status built on the rejection of the concept of equity in and of itself. So here we have the second and third manhood act. So the second one is the enactment of group-based dominance, as I say, related to my points in the previous slide. Boys, particularly in kind of unsupervised or loosely monitored spaces like playgrounds, they are forming visible packs to harass, intimidate, surveil women teachers. And as these quotes suggest, on the left, they reflect that these spaces and this kind of group interaction that happens. So talking about barking at staff, surrounding female teachers and trapping them in the yard. There's plenty of this kind of data that says very similar kinds of points. The second one suggesting, this teacher is talking about when she tries to move on a group of boys from loitering, basically in the wrong area. They whisper and point and pretend they couldn't hear her, and then one says she can't do shit to us. So this kind of increasing confidence that or a demonstration of power over the woman teacher. And again, I guess what's crucial here in terms of pack mentality is that this behavior isn't incidental, it's homosocial, and it aligns with what Georgia Thomas Parr has recently described as a parasocial fraternity. So what we're seeing, we think, through what the teachers are seeing and what we observe through the teachers' accounts, is that these groups are enacting power as performance, like not just for the authority figure who they're kind of taking down a peg or two in their estimation, but also for one another. And even though it's not explicit, there are plenty of threads here that tie these behaviors to the manosphere and to manosphere rituals in the way. So pack surveillance, ritual humiliation, reward through peer approval. This is also stuff that we see kind of promoted through the manosphere. So we're kind of suggesting in this work that the young boys in this context are showing how offline affective bonds mimic those bonds cultivated by digital manfluencers and actors in the manosphere. So thirdly, then, we have the sexualization of women, the overt sexualization of women. So as we know, sexualization is one of the most consistent and harmful manhood acts that you can imagine, and it happens so frequently in this data set. And it functions not just as a way to harass, but also as a way to undermine women teachers' legitimacy and their authority. Again, a long-standing idea in the literature, particularly in the work of Kerry Robinson in the early 2000s and the late 1990s. But so here is just a few examples. So this one teacher is describing how boys rated girls in PowerPoints, and they used images of porn actors in the class. And then the next one, where kind of totally intimidating the teacher, thrusting behind her while she was helping another student, and that this was being filmed. And then this one even more horribly, if you can even have a scale of horror. The student followed the teacher, asked about her body, her clothes, and then touched her. And then, unfortunately, even though it was reported, the student was taken out of class, but came back very quickly and was back to his normal self within just a few weeks. And again, what we're pointing to here is that these observations are kind of indicative of actions that mimic something, and they mimic pornographic power scripts. So this kind of hierarchy where women are devalued and made the spectacle, reflecting this kind of like pornification of culture that Ros Gill talked about 15 years ago now, where sexualization becomes a normalized mechanism of dominance. And again, a little bit, it's pretty grim. I won't read out all of the content, but I suppose these are not the people. There's other people in the data that talk about how their colleagues have experienced this as well, so they don't feel alone, but they're very aware of the kind of rampant sexualization of women through schools. And yeah, the point is that these are not edge cases, they're widespread. And one thing I forgot to say at the beginning when I was talking about the data, actually, where the data comes from, the respondents represent a wide range of schools. So in Australia, we have a very different system compared to the UK, for example, and about 65% of schools are state schools, and then the other 35 are made up of this amalgam of kind of private, independent, religious, and so on. And what we find here is that all of the stuff I'm talking to you about, including this, is present throughout. And so what's happening is not just widespread in a school, but widespread across the whole kind of private and public education sector. And they all point to this kind of failure of institutional accountability to protect staff, and a growing kind of cultural permission of boys from all social backgrounds to use sexualization as an everyday performance of masculinity. Okay, on to the fourth and fifth one. So the fourth manhood act that we identify or kind of work with here is we call it humor as baiting. So it's about using irony, mockery, or provocation to assert power and deny harm. And this aligns with both the manhood acts literature and the virtual manhood acts literature, where humor is kind of central to normalizing misogyny and, importantly, dodging accountability as well. So the first example here, the teacher is saying that she turned around and the boy was pretending to slap her butt, and then he stopped when she saw him. But then what becomes obvious, and this is again a thread through most of the data, when they challenge these kinds of things, these kinds of actions, they're turned into a joke. So the defense is always the same. Like the defense is always, it's just a joke. You're overreacting because you're a feminist. And the point, I suppose, is that the humor is not benign. It functions as a smokescreen, right? Like it legitimizes violence as comedy. It reinscribes gender hierarchy. It silences the possibility of discipline and the possibility of critique. So when the teachers are hearing, oh, this is just a joke and you can't take a joke, what's happening is it's kind of defending. weaponizing post-feminist discourses of irony and presenting teachers who respond in this way as like kind of being humorless or overreacting in some way. So one kind of corollary of that is that it shifts the focus away from perpetrators and onto the sensitivity of the target. And especially when that target is a woman in authority or supposed authority in the classroom. So I guess the point is that the humor is it's not humor as levity, but humor as a vehicle, as an act of discipline and deflection. So then fifthly, the last point is that we were talking about withdrawal, essentially. So rejection of education. So disinvestment in schooling as a marker of masculine identity. So again, these kinds of things have been present before. And I think that's, again, really important to stress that all five of these things that we're kind of grouping together as manhood acts, we want to reiterate, we call them reanimated for a reason, because it's even though they've been there all the time, they are animated in such a way that they become more normalized, more present, more pervasive, and more difficult to handle effectively. So what we have here is that for some boys, rejecting education becomes this way to claim status. And there are echoes here of the kind of 1970s work of Paul Willis and so on, where rejection of education was held up as being the way to prove one's masculinity. But it's this the kind of new context that is important. So this is a context right now where like kind of Andrew Tate style ideology equates value with wealth and defiance and self-sufficiency. And these things are and an overt rejection of education. Actually, you would have seen, I'm sure, that Andrew Tate uses some kind of nonsense claim around like doctors can't afford a Bugatti, so why would you ever go to school to try and be a doctor? And again, overlaps with previous slides in terms of what the data is here, but the focus here is on this kind of deliberate disengagement from learning, and the data often picks up different threads of all of the different manhood acts in one go. So the first content here is on the right-hand side is talking about how the kids watch porn in class and they disrespect the teacher even after they call home. And this teacher left couldn't take it in the school. And the second one is interesting because it's from a teacher, an elite private school. They said that the child says to the teacher, school doesn't matter because they'd be supported financially by the family, and then they mock the teacher's pay. And what's happening is that teachers are describing that these boys dismiss school as irrelevant or beneath them. And again, it's not all boys, but it's a growing pocket of boys in the estimation of teachers. And the masculine capital of all these kids that are engaging in this action, or the boys that are engaging in this action, is gained through a kind of anti-authoritarian rejection of effort, rejection of rules, rejection of teachers, and rejection of women teachers in particular, as they go about kind of policing gender boundaries. And again, I think in the paper we try to trace the ways that these are deeply connected to manosphere values, where the school is framed as say, like in Tate's words, kind of emasculating, and the real world is, to quote those guys in that space, the real world is the hustle. And in this view, then teachers are kind of obstacles or servants. Education is for the weak, and defiance is this kind of defying education, and rejecting education is a kind of badge of manhood, a badge of honor in a way. Okay, what this data, I think, shows us is that there's an erosion of a boundary between online and offline masculinity, if that boundary was ever so kind of firm in the first place. But certainly, if it was, as it was kind of presented to be in the literature 5 years ago, then something different is happening here. These teacher testimonies show us that these behaviors that perhaps were thought to rely on anonymity in a way, these virtual manhood acts in Melonian Love's language, they're now being performed face to face in classrooms, in halls, in schoolyards, and they include things like belittling and provocation, which we call backlash misogyny. They include intimidation through a pack mentality. They include dismissal of complaint, of legitimate critique through irony and humor, and a way of baiting teachers into a conversation as well. They include objectification and increased sexualization of women, and they include a disengagement from school, a disinvestment from schooling, and a kind of reliance on manfluence and narratives that education is not the route to the things that you want in life, but the hustle and exploitation actually is. And again, it's minor in the sense that it's a minority, but the point really is that it's not super fringe. They're not subcultural behaviors in some sense. They're visible, they're repeated, they're socially reinforced. They are suggestive that there are some kind of versions of masculinity that are catalyzed online and have been reanimated offline with minimal fear of consequence. And then finally, just wrapping this up. So the kind of argument here is that the shift is not accidental. It reflects a convergence of powerful socio-political forces, including the kind of instability and epistemological instability of post-truth, the post-truth moment and post-truth discourse, and how that overrides opinion. Where opinion overrides expertise. But it also includes the backlash to the Me Too movement and broader feminist gains, and also then the mainstreaming of manosphere ideology, which, driven by algorithms, kind of reframes male dominance potentially as common sense, and certainly that's their effort to make women's empowerment seem as a threat. So, at the same time, then we have the ubiquity of smartphones, we have poor regulation, I guess, as well, and definitely the dominance of this algorithm-driven content that ensures that there's a daily saturation of manosphere content in boys' social media diets, and it's this kind of performative masculinity, yes. And whilst we want to be very careful of kind of leaning into a moral panic suggestion of consuming media equates to poor behavior, the constellation of all of these things at the same time, certainly these forces seem to have generated the possibility for a boldness, a hyper-expressive and effectively charged form of masculinity that celebrates that domination is a route to recognition. So that's something that is always there, it's always in our culture, and something that we're fighting hard to adjust, but it's kind of on drugs. And of course, all of these things are monetized as well. So I guess the point really is that whilst figures like Andrew Tate function as a kind of cultural archetype through which boys interpret and act out this kind of remedial backlash, it's done so in a way that's really, really problematic, and even happens when like the likes of Tate and whatever figurehead might come after him, they may come and go, but these people have ramped up an ideological legacy, and therefore the kind of manosphere's key actors, the legacy of the manosphere key actors kind of persists. So even when we don't see them and they're kind of less visible, these things have happened, and has been a catalyst for this new form of misogyny, we would argue. So where that leaves us with again, Georgia Thomas Power has been really good on this, writing very recently this year, I think, beginning of 25. She says we must urgently work towards a sustainable and inclusive feminism for contemporary boys, and arguing that in the manosphere, boyhood itself is devalued, it's coded as weak, it's emasculated and lacking. And then the manosphere kind of presents this idea of a fast track out of boyhood and into a performative manhood that's built on dominance and heterosexism and defiance of the establishment, whatever the establishment is. And that's something that we have to take into account, that this is what's being offered to boys, and how can we counter that? And I suppose I'll just close by saying that these masculinities are not incidental to schooling. They are reshaping classroom atmospheres. They're reshaping peer hierarchies. They are the very conditions under which women teachers can do their job. So at the very least, it's a health and safety concern, a workplace safety concern. And so in our own advocacy, what we've done is call on schools and government departments and agencies to take this seriously, not just through kind of individualized interventions, or at the other end, even kind of punitive punishment measures, but through critical structural responses. And the start of that, I think, is that we need an honest reckoning with how gender power and digital manifestations of masculinity and promotion of harmful masculinities, how these things intersect, and how we might work towards normalizing the rejection of domination as a legitimate route to manhood. Thank you. I hope that was interesting.